we go. As I mentioned, this webinar is brought to you by the Assessment Quality Special Interest Group. This SIG is led by Professor Simon Bedford from Western Sydney University. My name is Dr. Praneeth Anand. I am from University of New South Wales. And if you'd like to join us, search for us on Facebook or just scan us using the QR code that's on the screen at the moment. Now, we've had a number of webinars. In March, we had Professor David Carlos, I think is a colleague of Yuzo. And today we've got Yuzo joining us as well. There'll be no webinar in July because we've got a HRSA conference in Brisbane. In August, we'll have Dr. James Wood from UK joining us, talking about technology mediated feedback. Reminder, in July 4th to 7th, we have the HRSA conference. Please search it up using Google. And if you haven't registered, please register to join us over there. There will be a special interest group meetup during the conference program. So look that up and come and say hi. Now, assessments, the topic of today's webinar is around how does assessments shape student identities. As you all know, assessments often tend to consume the most amount of time in students' lives. And as David Carlos has mentioned in the past, students are able to avoid bad teaching. And we know they have been doing that if you just look at lecture attendance. But unfortunately, they cannot avoid bad assessments. So it's very, very important for us to devote as much time as possible to design assessments that really engages students. And if the students are spending that amount of time in this particular part of the learning ecosystem, then we must try and use it to do more than just assess the learning. So assessments tend to drive students to engage in the learning. Many assessments tend to be very generic, especially in my discipline areas, computer science, STEM. Most of the assessments tend to be very, if you like, exam-oriented type of thing. I think there's opportunity to look for us to look at different ways of assessing students and what else can we do with assessments. On that note, it's probably timely that we've got Yuzo joining us today. Yuzo is an assistant professor at the Faculty of Education at University of Hong Kong. He's also a Banting Fellow at Ontario Tech University, Canada. He's an honorary fellow at the Cradle Deakin in Australia. His research focuses on student experiences of assessment and feedback and student formation in higher education and inclusive assessment. If you'd like to follow Yuzo, please look him up on Twitter. And on that note, I'll invite Yuzo and I'll stop sharing my screen now. Welcome, Yuzo.
Thank you so much for a lovely introduction, Praneeth. Let me just share my screen. All right, could I get a thumbs up if you can see my slides?
Perfect.
Wonderful. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are at the moment. I would like to denote the next 30-ish minutes for presenting some ideas on assessment and student identity formation and about how we could theorize the connection of these two rather large ideas. And I would be very glad to have a proper discussion after that. So I'm doing my best to keep my time around that 30 minutes. What I would like to do with this time is to first provide some theoretical ideas about this connection between assessment and student identity formation. I will mostly talk about the context of higher education, but after the presentation, I would be more than glad to have those conversations about whether and how you could apply these ideas in your context if you work in primary or secondary education or vocational education. Next, I would like to provide some empirical findings based on my own research by giving a kind of like a negative example of how assessment might, in fact, hinder positive types of identity formation in higher education. This second part focuses on my research on or with students with disabilities in higher education. And finally, I would like to propose some future directions to assessment research and some practical implications as well. So let's start by talking about how assessment and identity formation as very broad ideas are connected to each other. Whoop. My overall argument today, and really, if you want to remember one single thing from the whole seminar, I hope this is it. I argue that assessment is first and foremost a matter of identity formation. When we think about scholarly research on assessment, this field of research has for decades and decades focused mostly on the idea of learning. How could assessment certify and promote learning? We have this mantra that we have repeated in a form or another, that assessment drives student learning, and we have a lot of research showing that the way we assess largely steers our students' learning and studying processes and has an impact on many things such as learning outcomes, self-regulation, self-efficacy, and so forth. This is all extremely important, and there's no reason for me to criticize this type of research. But what I would like to discuss today is the more longer-term effects of assessment. So assessment is, of course, related to learning. The whole purpose of assessment is to check whether students have reached certain standards in higher education and beyond, and at the same time promote students' learning. At the same time, assessment also influences our students' identity formation in multiple complex and intertwined ways. So my first and key argument today that assessment is a matter of identity formation. And then, of course, the next question is how and why does this matter? So I think the whole idea of assessment and identity formation, it's a bit of an awkward topic in higher education. When I've been talking about this topic, I've been often asked, what does assessment have to do with student identities? We have this understanding of assessment that it needs to build on ideas of fairness, equality, and meritocracy. Assessment assesses, by definition, student skills, abilities, whatever our learning outcomes are, but we do not assess students' identities. Assessment is conceptualized as this link between often course learning outcomes or program learning outcomes, some kinds of objectives that we want our students to learn, and our teaching methods. So with assessment, we check whether and how students have reached these objectives. We are not supposed to assess our students' personalities or identities. And you could argue that if I let my students' personal characteristics influence my assessment and grading practices, for example, by assigning lower grades to my female students in my background, something must be done with this situation. It's not an ideal situation at all. So, and I absolutely understand this stance to assessment and this very profound way of conceptualizing assessment. Of course, it needs to be fair. It needs to be equal for all students. So in some sense, one way to kick off this webinar would be to state that assessment is not related to student identities. It's related to student learning and learning outcomes. However, we also know that assessment shapes our students' futures and identities. This is something that we can't avoid. And here we simply must understand that assessment is doing many things at the same time. I would like to show a very brief video. It's only for 1 minute. Let's see if the technology works. You might hear the sounds, you might not, and the video might work or it might not, but let's just give it a go. So this video is from the context of China, and it shows a couple of students as they receive their Gaokao results, which is a high-stakes exam that determines students' educational pathways after compulsory education. I can hear the sounds. Hopefully you can hear them too.
Then we can hear the sounds.
All right, maybe I'll just leave it there. You can watch the whole video yourself if you want to. I would say that, let me just, I would say that we all know deep in our hearts that assessment is all about identity formation. Even though, this is, again, one of my key arguments today, scholarly research on assessment has mostly downplayed this connection between assessment and identities by focusing more on the aspects of student learning. At the same time, I would very strongly argue that we have all this social and cultural knowledge about how assessment is connected to our very identities, whether we're talking about personal or academic identities. I think that video shows in a very powerful way how we know that assessment shapes our lives and futures, our very understanding of ourselves as human beings. We have this knowledge, and even though scholarly research has perhaps not captured that knowledge, it is there out there in our cultural world. For example, because at the moment I teach in the context of Hong Kong, my students, when I showed them this video, they were having many kinds of emotions because many of them have gone through the Gaokao exam and they recognize these similar feelings. And perhaps I could ask you to think about if you have some similar strong emotional memories about how assessment has influenced your own identity, your own understanding of yourself as a student or even as a citizen. All right, so that's my starting point. So far I've been talking about this idea of identity in a rather loose and ambiguous way. Let me briefly define what I mean with this concept that has, of course, been used in multiple different types of ways in educational research. There's so much research on the idea of identity in education. I recently checked, I did a bit of a review for myself about review articles that have focused on identity in education. I could easily find over 100 review articles, and these are only the review articles on identity in educational context. So we have so much research and we have so many different perspectives on identity. In this talk, I will mostly focus on students' professional identity formation, as I'm talking about the context of higher education. I consider identity formation as a social and cultural process. And through assessment, students are socialized into their professional communities. Again, talking about higher education mostly here. And even though identity, of course, has the personal element, it is very much a social and cultural product, and assessment plays a role in how it is shaped. And the question for me is, how are student identities constructed by students themselves as well as others? And what is the role of assessment here? The theoretical framework that I've been using in my work, and today we can really talk about this in a rather broad way, but this book really grounds the theoretical foundations for my work. This absolutely wonderful book by Rachel Brooks and Sarah O'Shea maps out our ways of thinking about how students are constructed in higher education. And what they note is that we still know relatively little about how students themselves understand their identity as students and how they are constructed as social agents. So even though identity research in itself is a rather established field of research, in higher education, there's still much more to know. When it comes to assessment and feedback, as said, we have this social and cultural knowledge about how, by taking part of various types of assessment, we shape our understanding of ourselves. But scholarly research is lagging behind, and we only have this rather emerging area of research, and my presentation really calls for more research on unpacking this connection between assessment and identities. One another helpful resource that I found influential for my own thinking is this nowadays a rather old book by Derek Rowntree from 1977 that focuses on assessment design in higher education. What Rowntree argues is that assessment produces knowledge about students' abilities. So even in the title of his book, he asks, how should we know them? How should we know our students? And assessment is exactly that one way for us teachers to know our students, particularly in higher education, where we do not spend as much time with each individual students as we might in, say, primary or secondary education. It is exactly assessment that makes our students visible to us. We see our students through our assessment tasks. And in a similar way, every assessment situation provides information about students' abilities in relation to learning objectives. So every time students take part in assessment and are assessed, they receive this information, and they can then use that for their identity formation in many kinds of ways. As students take part in assessment, they are constantly challenged to ask, who am I as a future professional? What type of knowledge does this assessment practice tell me about my abilities, particularly from the viewpoint of who am I as a future professional? There's an aspect of ethics that I have to address. This is very substantial for my own work on student identities in assessment. When we talk about assessment in particular, there's always kind of a power imbalance between who assesses whom and who has more power in determining someone else's identity. And in my recent work with Lily Yang from the University of Hong Kong, we have theorized how assessment is a way of forming students from afar. Assessment is most commonly designed and implemented by not students, but by teachers, by educational experts, which is absolutely fine, of course. But at the same time, it means that some people have more power over someone else's identity formation. And that happens through assessment. Every individual assessment practice may have a long-standing influence on our students' professional identity. But of course, this is a very complex and not a simple process in any way. I definitely do not want to be deterministic. Assessment does not simply define someone's identity just like that. Instead, it provides almost like building blocks for our students. They code knowledge about students' abilities that students can then use to build up their professional identities. And we need to be very aware that, of course, not all assessment simply sticks to our identity. For example, the wonderful work by Naomi Winstone and colleagues has been addressing this issue of students not being interested in feedback at all. The students might just check the grade and log out rather than deeply engage with assessment information and let that influence their identities in some kind of way. We might also use assessment explicitly as a way to develop our students' professional identities. There's not a lot of research on this idea. For example, in our recent review with Margaret Beeman and Rola Achavi, we conducted a review about authentic assessment, particularly when it comes to its digital forms. And we noticed that there's really a depth of research when it comes to noticing how authentic assessment develops students' professional identities. Research has mostly focused on the ideas of skills and learning, which again is very important, but I do think that there's a bit more to uncover. It may be that authentic assessment that asks our students to take part in authentic practices, to use authentic tools that people use in their disciplinary field. It might be that these types of assessment tasks provide our students a way to develop their identities, their sense of who am I as a future professional, who am I as a deeply personal professional. So to close off the first part of the presentation, let me sum up. So my argument so far has been that assessment shapes student identities. It provides students building blocks that they then use in complex ways to know themselves, to build their professional identities, and perhaps personal identities as well. And these building blocks are very strongly related to students' abilities, because assessment is about abilities. Next up, let me provide you an example of assessment and student formation gone wrong. So in a way, I would like to provide an example of what not to do in an ideal situation. This part of the presentation is based on my earlier postdoctoral research project that I conducted at the University of Eastern Finland under the guidance of Professor Päivi Atjonen. I conducted a research project where I tried to understand assessment from the viewpoint of students with disabilities in Finnish universities. And I conducted a mixed method study using various types of methods, and I would like to provide you a couple of snippets of what I found in this project when it comes to the idea of how assessment shapes our students' identities. So I'll focus on how, through assessment, students come to understand themselves as able students or as disabled students. And I will focus on how assessment is, in fact, a key player in this that's how assessment creates these cultural narratives about what kinds of students are right or normal in higher education, and the profound influence of assessment in this cultural knowledge. So let me provide you some very tangible examples from this project. I'll start with a snippet of my policy analysis. So drawing on the work of Brooks and O'Shea, as said before, I understand identity formation as a social and cultural process. In this case, educational policy plays a key role in providing those building blocks for our students to understand themselves. So I started by trying to understand how university policies on assessment and students with disabilities construct students, how it portrays students as certain types of social agents. And I conducted a policy analysis by focusing on 10 Finnish-speaking Finnish universities. And I analyzed all the policies related to assessment adjustments, such as extra time in exams, and all other types of assessment that considered students with disabilities in particular. And what I noticed in this study was that these policy documents in Finland, they very largely or strongly portrayed students with disabilities as this ontologically separate group from normal students. And these policy documents really made this division visible. The documents portrayed these students as being special students, and the word special was really quite often used in my dataset. And these adjustments that the students might need to make assessment accessible, such as personal testing spaces, were framed as special adjustments, something special for these special students who are not normal students or typical students in higher education. I think this really sets the ground for how students come to understand themselves. And let me provide you an example of that I think very nicely sums up this student portrayal. This is a snippet from one of the documents from one Finnish university that provided students instructions for sitting examinations in a special room. So this document is for students who, due to accessibility issues, cannot take part in exams in the typical exam hall with hundreds of students sitting in lines, but who may benefit from having a personal space for doing their exam. Even though this type of an adjustment is very much needed to ensure fair assessment for everyone, I did notice that in these documents, the way that we talk to students does portray a certain type of an understanding of how these students are, what types of identities the students have. So this instruction document the students need to read when they go to this special examination room that was in fact called special in the documents. It says, take your writing equipment out and hang your outdoor clothing and bag on the rack in the room. Shut down your phone and put it in your bag or in the pocket of your jacket. There can be nothing else on the table, for example, a phone or a drinking bottle, unless you have a special permission for that. Information about the approved adjustments is written on the exam envelope. It is forbidden to touch the computer, the keyboard, and the computer mouse in the room. My argument in this study was that with this kind of language, with these types of practices, we portray students with disabilities as a danger that needs to be handled through surveillance and assessment security practices. And I think the tone of these types of documents is something quite powerful. The students need to read this document when they attend an exam in this room. I think the tone would be something that if someone would talk to me at work like this, I wouldn't think that the person thinks that I'm a colleague, but I'm somehow, I need to be surveilled. I can't be trusted. So this is what I argue sets the ground for how students come to understand themselves. Another example, this time from research related to students with disabilities and assessment in higher education. I conducted a literature review of studies focusing on assessment adjustments for students with disabilities in higher education. And I looked at how these scholarly research outputs portray students, what kind of almost like an identity category these documents construct. Again, I would argue that these are public discourses and they are not they do not have a direct association to how students come to understand themselves, but they do contribute to public understanding of students with disabilities and in assessment situations in particular. And again, these documents strongly portrayed students with disabilities as an ontologically separate group from ideal or typical students in assessment. But what this adds to my policy analysis is that in these research outputs, this division was made very scientific based on valid and reliable research on cognition. Let me provide you a couple of examples. I argue that these research outputs largely portray students with disabilities as a spanner in the works that portrays a danger to assessment, some kind of threat that needs to be mitigated. It was noted in these studies that students with disabilities are potential cheaters in assessment. I won't read the whole excerpt out loud, but you can have a look yourself if you want to. And this prevention of cheating was in fact having a very large role in these 26 studies that I analyzed. Students with disabilities were also portrayed as a costly burden for universities. When they take part in assessment adjustments, we need more resources, we need more money. And in that sense, we need to make sure that the smallest possible number of students make use of these adjustments. For example, here, one of the studies provides some calculations about how costly students with disabilities are for universities, in assessment in particular. All right, so these are some of the public discourses that again, set the tone for how students could come to understand themselves through assessment. Well, of course, in this project, I was also interested in the students' own voice. And that is why I conducted a study by asking the students themselves, how do they see themselves in assessment situations? Or how has assessment constructed their identities? And here I provide a couple of snippets of what I found in this study. Many students talk about themselves as the others, completely separate from those typical and normal students. And again, this was connected to assessment in particular. One student noted that it feels like being labeled as invalid and disabled when you apply for help. Now that I've ended up studying at university, I feel that I just have to survive. So this student did not want to apply for assessment adjustments in fear of getting labeled as the other. Another student really takes part in this public discourse about students with disabilities taking extra resources in assessment. The student says, I feel embarrassed to ask examiners to take notice of me and arrange my own proctor and special room for exams. So just as these are policy documents and research outputs were talking about these students as an extra burden for universities, a similar way of discussing their own identity is seen in empirical data as well. And indeed, in this study, I noticed that inaccessible assessment is not only a matter of setting barriers for learning for students with disabilities, but a matter of setting barriers for positive forms of identity construction. One of the students portrayed themselves as the slow one. There are no assessment practices that don't suit me, just ones that I need more time with. This shows how the students has come to understand themselves as a slow one. And assessment here has played a role in how this identity formation has happened. Many students are talked about themselves as the wrong types of learners. And again, assessment was the main mechanism here. One student noticed that the point of the course is to teach important skills related to accounting, calculations, and interpretations of data. You can't assess those skills only based on overly long essays. And this student shared how they were studying counting, if I don't remember incorrectly, and the assessment practices were inaccessible from the viewpoint of the students' disabilities, which has led them to understand themselves as a wrong type of a learner. As I briefly noted in the introduction part of the presentation, there's always an ethical aspect of who determines or who provides the building blocks for whom for their identity formation. In a forthcoming narrative study that I'm currently working with, I'm shedding light on how the issue when it comes to assessment shaping the identities of students with disabilities is a matter of whether students have agency over that assessment. And I wanted to provide you just a snippet of what I found in this study, even though this study hasn't been published yet, so be careful when making interpretations of this non-peer-reviewed work just yet. The students noted, so this was a narrative interview study conducted with students with disabilities. The students noted that the issue is that they rarely have agency over their own assessment tasks and designs. And the students themselves noted that that means that someone else can determine their identities as those wrong types of learners. One of the students told me in the interview that there is no way for us students to have our say on assessment. I have a friend who studied here 10 years ago, and the same issues in assessment were already present back then. How is it possible that nothing happens in 10 years? How much do teachers care about the voice of us students? And this student was sharing a story of how assessment had remained inaccessible and very exam focused in their studies. And very much related to this issue, many students noted that assessment is designed by normals, by using a word of one of the students. One student noted that assessment provides you with a frame, and you need to be a certain kind of a student to fit that frame. Multiple choice questions are an integral part of law studies, but I think they favor a certain type of a learner. And another student said that it always stresses me out in exam situations to know that there are so many normals who can write faster than me. It makes me depressed. I think these two student quotes are wonderful examples about how assessment constructs student identities in relation to the normals. And this is very much a matter of assessment being designed by those normals as well. To sum up this second part of the presentation, what I'm arguing here is that without explicitly designing assessment for the diversity of learners and the diversity of identities in our classrooms, assessment may set up barriers for not only for learning, but for identity development, as I think you could see quite clearly and strongly from these student quotes. And now let me proceed to my final part, but I'm just going to check the time at this point. All right. Yes. Sorry, I just needed to stop sharing for 1 sec to do that. I will just wrap up in a few minutes and then kick off the conversation. So just a few implications. As mentioned, assessment research has largely not considered the idea of student identity formation. So I have a couple of implications for assessment research. First and foremost, we do need to understand the processes of identity formation in and through assessment. This, I think, I have already discussed over this presentation. There is a connection between assessment and identity formation. What that connection is and how that connection plays out in students' own narratives about their identities is something that assessment research simply needs to unpack. So let me just proceed because I'm going to be aware of the time. Second, we need to understand the diversity of our students' identities in assessment. When we take this one-size-fits-all approach to assessment, we might be in danger of setting barriers for our students' identity formation in higher education. And to me, this is a very depressing outcome of higher education in a way. It might be that some of our graduates with disabilities, for example, are very skillful and capable in their profession, but they have a negative understanding of themselves. And again, the role of assessment here is not irrelevant. When we talk about something as complex as identity formation, we do need longitudinal research. We do need to unpack how these identities are constructed over time and how assessment situations shape those identities as students proceed in higher education. So this is certainly one of my main implications. At the same time, this longitudinal approach could be something that we might utilize in assessment. So this is a practical implication. How could we support all students' identity formation through assessment in longitudinal ways? There are some pockets of inspiring examples. For example, there's quite a bit of research on the longitudinal use of e-portfolios, particularly in medical and teacher education, and how they might provide the means for students to understand themselves as future professionals. But more research and more practice-tied research is certainly needed in this area. All right, let me just wrap up by noting that my argument today is that assessment is all about being and becoming. Assessment is all about identity formation. But of course, I've been talking about this matter in a very broad sense. So the key question for everyone in the audience is, in practice, what does this mean for assessment design in your context, whether it's a national context or a disciplinary context? How could you, what can you take from this presentation to bring to your own context? And this is really something that I would love to discuss with you. All right. Thank you very much, everyone. If you have any thoughts, questions, ideas, please do reach out to me. Here's my email address, my Twitter handle. And of course, I'd be very glad to hear some questions.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that, Yuzo. The chat has been going it's been quite busy. There's a lot of things in the chat and I was struggling to keep up. So I'm just going to open it up. If you've got any questions, comments, etc., maybe it's best to just unmute yourself and ask Yuzo his opinions about that directly.
Can I go first?
Yes, go for it.
And that's because it's going up to 1 a.m. here. So I'm delighted to be in the seminar. It was a lovely presentation and I've made copious notes here. Because just so we'll know that identity is something that's of interest to me personally. For my own PhD work, but I'm also I teach computer science like Pranit, and one of the things that has been on my mind for a long time is relates to how we do what we call final year projects. It's like students do like a big thesis, well, undergraduate thesis in the final year of their study. And I think we have struggled to come up with a way of thinking about what that project should really mean. Sometimes we think of it as students having to prove themselves because they're now about to go to work. So what maybe prove to us that they are ready. But we have a range of students, right? Some of them are, they want different things. So anyway, that's a little bit of what I've been thinking about. And I think after my PhD, I'm going to press on with this a little bit more, because I never thought of assessment explicitly being linked with identity. And though I do those two things, I think the seminar brought those two together for me. So that's what I'm taking away. The question I have, though, is I've been using one framework on identity